She didn't stop talking because she stopped loving him. She stopped talking because she finally heard herself. And what she heard changed everything. There's a silence that comes after heartbreak, but that's not this. This silence is different. It's not filled with pain, but with power. It doesn't scream, "I'm done." It whispers, "I'm whole." The divine feminine's silence isn't a gap to be filled. It's a mirror being held up, steady, sacred, unstoppable. And when the masculine looks into that mirror, he doesn't see rejection. He sees everything he hasn't yet become. Have you been feeling the pull to say less, to stop chasing closure, to sit quietly with your truth even when no one understands it? That's not you giving up. That's you returning to your frequency. And that return, it shakes everything. Because her silence isn't a sign she's gone. It's a signal that she's becoming. And now, he has to feel her not in her words, but in her absence of need. Welcome to the moment where silence stops meaning nothing's happening and starts meaning everything is. And it begins now. She didn't choose silence to disappear. She chose it to finally appear, fully, clearly, and without distortion. There is a kind of stillness that only emerges after she's given everything. Her words, her presence, her tears, her prayers. And still, nothing changed. Still, the masculine didn't meet her where her soul already stood. And so, she stopped reaching outward, not out of bitterness, not out of punishment, but because her inner voice became louder than the echo of unreciprocated energy. Her silence is not a wall, it's a mirror, one that reflects, without force, the truth of where the energy is misaligned. One that shows the divine masculine what it feels like to stand in the absence of her effort and be left only with his own. This silence isn't cold. It's consecrated. It's where the divine feminine reclaims her essence. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she started honoring herself. She's not punishing him. She's preparing herself. Because for too long, she tried to bridge the space between them with explanation. She begged the universe for signs. She asked the same questions in circles. Why isn't he awakening? Why can't he feel what I feel? Why does this connection hurt more than it heals? But the deeper truth, she was holding too much, holding the energy of both hearts, holding the emotional weight of a soul cut by a contract that was never meant to be carried alone. So now, she lets go. Not of love, but of control. Not of the bond, but of the noise. And in that letting go, she meets the version of herself who doesn't need to be heard to be felt. Her silence is not passive. It's magnetic. It pulls the masculine inward, into reflection, into discomfort, into remembrance. Because when she stops speaking, he can finally hear what's been inside of him all along. Not the echo of her voice, but the truth of his own avoidance. And that's why this silence is powerful. Because it isn't filled with longing anymore. It isn't trying to provoke, seduce, or manipulate the outcome. It simply is. And that kind of energy, still, sovereign, grounded, is impossible to ignore. She has become the mirror. And a mirror doesn't chase, it waits, not in expectation, but in clarity. She's not asking him to come back. She's inviting him to rise. Can you feel this in yourself now? This inner shift from needing validation to simply knowing? The way your body feels calmer when you stop explaining yourself, even in your thoughts. That's alignment. That's you exiting the cycle of proving and entering the realm of embodiment. And the masculine feels it. He may not admit it, he may not know how to respond, but he feels the silence. Not as absence, but as invitation. An invitation to meet her in a new way, without codependency, without projection, without delay. Because in the quiet, all distractions fade. And what remains is the truth, the bond, the mirror, and the choice. Her silence says, I am not waiting for you to see me. I am standing in the fullness of who I've become. If you wish to meet me here, come whole, come ready, come real. This is the power of the divine feminine in her fullness, not loud, not desperate, but present, rooted, unapologetically still. And in that stillness, she becomes the mirror the masculine cannot look away from, no matter how far he runs, because the reflection she offers isn't just of her, it's of himself. Not the version he shows the world, but the one who longs for love he doesn't yet know how to hold. The one who remembers her soul in silence, because silence was where they met the first time. So if you're being pulled inward, if your voice feels quiet, your energy more sacred, trust that. You are not retreating, you are reflecting. And what you reflect now is love. Not through words, but through presence. And that is more powerful than anything you could ever say. Why he feels more in her stillness than in her words. There's a sacred shift that happens when she stops explaining herself. When the divine feminine no longer tries to convince him of the connection, when she releases the need to be understood, when she walks into stillness with grace instead of fear, he feels it. And what he feels isn't absence, it's pressure. Not the kind that suffocates, but the kind that awakens, because her silence creates space. And in that space, his own energy has nowhere left to hide. Without her words to fill the air, he's left with his own. Without her presence reaching out, he's left with his own emptiness. And in that mirror of stillness, something stirs in him that her love, in all its expression, never could. He begins to feel her everywhere, in the way the air shifts when he thinks of her, in the way his chest tightens when she doesn't check in the way his thoughts return to her, not as fantasy, but as unfinished resonance. Because silence is not the absence of sound, it's the amplification of truth. And now that she's no longer cushioning the connection with effort, he's faced with what's real, the echo of her energy and the void of his. This is the moment when the divine masculine begins to awaken, not from affection, but from consequence. Not punishment, but realization. That her presence was never guaranteed, that her love was not endless in form, only in essence. That her silence means she is no longer holding the weight of what he's not ready to carry. She's no longer explaining the pull. She's no longer decoding the signs for him. She's no longer asking, do you feel this too? And because of that, he does. He feels her in the quiet moments he used to overlook. He hears her name in songs that never used to matter. He dreams of her, not because she's pushing energy toward him, but because she's finally released the resistance that used to soften the blow. And now it hits, not her pain, his, the ache of not having her voice, the sting of her energy no longer buffering his avoidance, the sharp awareness that something is missing. And it's not just her attention, it's her mirror. The reflection that made him feel alive, seen cracked open. Now that mirror stands still, unmoving, unapologetic. And for the first time, he has to look at himself without her emotional presence trying to guide him. That's when he starts to remember. The moments she held him energetically when he didn't even know it. The love in her silence when she didn't respond in anger. The grace in her goodbye when she never closed the door. She simply stopped knocking. And the masculine, in his quiet awakening, begins to feel everything. Not through her words, not through her messages, but through the absence of them. Because when the feminine stops chasing, her energy becomes sharper, clearer, louder. She becomes a signal, not of need, but of power. And he can't escape it. She's not gone. She's everywhere. In the field, in his thoughts, in the moments when he turns inward and realizes she's not reaching anymore. And that stillness, that quiet refusal to beg for what she deserves, that's the moment he starts to truly feel her. Because now, he must come to her. Not because she asked, but because her silence commanded a response. Not from pressure, but from purity. And maybe he won't come with words yet. Maybe he won't show up in the way her mind still wonders about. But the energy has shifted, and he feels it. He feels her in his chest. He hears her in the silence. He notices that the piece she held is missing. And that's not emptiness. That's her mirror finally resting. So if you're in this phase where you've stopped speaking, where your silence isn't armor but surrender, trust that it's doing something sacred. He feels it, not as punishment, not as abandonment, but as a reflection of everything he's now being asked to become. Because your stillness isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new dynamic, one where love speaks not through noise, but through energy that no longer chases, but invites. And that invitation is the most powerful one of all. Silence can feel gentle on the surface, but beneath the quiet, there is a frequency that grows louder each day, especially for the one who ran from the mirror. When the divine feminine finally pulls her energy back, not with bitterness, not with force, but with sacred alignment, a pressure begins to rise in the divine masculine. It doesn't come as a crash. It arrives like a tightening in the chest, a restlessness, an invisible weight that follows him through the day and into his sleep. He can't trace it to any moment, yet it touches everything. It disturbs his peace in subtle ways, not to punish him, but to awaken him. Because for so long, he was used to her presence holding the emotional weight between them, her words, her forgiveness, her light. She was the warmth he thought would never dim, the lighthouse he believed would never stop glowing. Even when he disappeared, she stayed open. Even when he turned away, her love remained softly extended, not always in action, but in essence. Until now. Now her field has changed, not closed, but clean, not cold, but clear. And that shift, he feels it. He doesn't have the words for it. He may not know how to name it, but something in him is cracking under the weight of everything she is no longer holding for him. And that's where the pressure begins. He feels the emotional energy she once transmuted, now echoing back toward him. He begins to experience the void her presence once protected him from. He starts to notice the dull ache of her absence, not just in his heart, but in his identity. Because when she stops reaching, he must face what's within. And what's within is a soul that always knew she was home, but couldn't meet her at the door. Now he stands alone, not abandoned but mirrored. And in that mirror, the emotions surface. The guilt, the regret, the grief he buried in logic, the desire he refused to honor, the truth he pushed down beneath layers of ego and self-preservation. All of it rises now, not as punishment, but as invitation. Because this pressure is sacred. It's the undoing of avoidance. It's the collapse of excuses. It's the divine discomfort that cracks the shell of the asleep masculine and whispers to his soul, "It's time, rise." He doesn't know how to hold it at first. He may distract, he may run again, he may numb, avoid, or deny. But nothing works like it used to, because her silence created space. And space is where transformation breathes. Without her energy filling the gap, he is left with the echo of his own truth. The echo that says, "You were loved, you were seen. And now that she's silent, you are being asked to see yourself." This is the pressure that shifts him. Not because she demanded it, but because her surrender removed every place he could hide from himself. And still, her silence isn't angry. It's awake. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain. It simply holds the field. Strong, soft, unmoving. And that's why it's working. Because the masculine cannot escape the mirror of her absence, not when her presence once felt like peace, not when her energy once held space for both of them, not when the love he took for granted has now returned to the one who gave it. That return to self is what creates the ache. The ache is what creates the reflection. And the reflection is what creates the awakening. So if you're the one holding silence right now, if you're feeling the pull to go quiet, not out of punishment but out of clarity, know this: he feels it. He may not tell you, he may not act on it right away. But the emotional pressure is building, not because you pulled away, but because you finally came home to you. And that kind of silence, it's not distance, it's divine alignment. And he can't run from what your soul is showing him now. Because silence, when rooted in truth, doesn't push him away. It calls him forward. How the feminine withdraws without abandoning love. She didn't walk away from love. She walked away from the need to prove it. From the cycles of chasing, overgiving, explaining herself to silence. From waiting for recognition in places where the energy no longer flowed in both directions. But even in her withdrawal, she never closed her heart. Because when the divine feminine steps back, it's not to shut him out. It's to let herself back in. There's a difference between abandonment and energetic retraction. One leaves from fear, the other returns from wisdom. And this is what she's doing now, not cutting the cord, not canceling the connection, but letting go of the illusion that she must carry it all. It was never her job to pull him forward. It was never her job to hold the light for both of them. It was never her purpose to wait in pain, proving her loyalty through her wounds. So she steps back, but not in bitterness, not in rebellion, not to manipulate the outcome. She steps back to breathe, to remember, to feel herself again. Because somewhere along the journey, she forgot the sound of her own heartbeat. She forgot the way her soul speaks when it's not trying to be understood. She forgot how powerful she is when she stops measuring her value through someone else's readiness. And now, in the silence, she remembers. She remembers that love doesn't require suffering, that presence isn't proven through persistence, that union doesn't mean self-abandonment, and that real love honors its own rhythm. This is how the feminine withdraws, not with anger, but with reverence, not with a slammed door, but with an open field of grace. She doesn't curse the journey. She blesses it. She releases the narrative that says she must hold on to be strong. And instead, she anchors into stillness to become clear. And in that clarity, she becomes unshakable. She can still love him without losing herself. She can still hold space without waiting. She can still feel him deeply and choose not to carry the ache anymore. Because love isn't something she has to fight for. It's something she is. And if it's real, truly sacred, it will find her again. Not because she chased it, but because she became a space where it could finally land. This is the power of her withdrawal. It's not rejection, it's redirection. She's not saying, "You don't matter." She's saying, "I do too." And that shift changes everything. She no longer pours into a cup that doesn't pour back. She no longer bends her truth to keep peace. She no longer offers her light in places that aren't willing to stand beside her in theirs. But she doesn't do this with coldness. She does it with sovereignty. She does it with tears dried by clarity. She does it with a soft smile and a grounded heart that whispers, "I trust the timing more than the fear." This is what it means to withdraw without abandoning love, to keep the door of the soul open but no longer stand in the rain, to honor the bond but no longer make it a cage, to feel the ache but not let it become the compass. Because now she's led by something else, not by reaction, but by resonance, not by what hurts, but by what heals. She hasn't given up on love. She's just stopped sacrificing herself for it. And in doing so, she becomes magnetic. Not because she wants to be chased, but because she's finally rooted in truth, her own. And when she stands in that frequency, calm, open, unshaken, he feels it. He feels the difference. He feels the clean boundary that doesn't need walls. He feels the invitation that doesn't beg, because her silence is not emptiness. It's containment, it's alignment, it's a love that's no longer bleeding, it's burning bright from within. And that kind of love is what changes everything. There comes a moment on the divine feminine's journey when she realizes that silence is no longer a reaction. It's a choice. A choice not to abandon the other, but to return entirely to herself. Not to punish, but to preserve. Not to manipulate, but to realign. Because after everything she gave, after every time she spoke with softness, after all the truths she tried to share from the depths of her heart, she finally understood. It was never about being louder. It was about becoming clearer. And clarity doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply withdraws its explanation. It no longer justifies its existence. It no longer pleads to be understood. It simply stands, sacred and still, in its own frequency. This is what reclaiming power looks like. It's not screaming, it's not proving. It's not trying to explain why she feels what she feels or why the connection matters. It's pausing, breathing, witnessing. And in that witnessing, she sees herself again. Not the version of her that was always reaching, but the one who knows how to hold her field like a temple. Because silence, when chosen consciously, isn't absence. It's presence amplified. And when she stops offering her voice where it isn't honored, it's not because she's disconnected from love. It's because she's finally connected to self-respect. This silence doesn't come from ego. It comes from inner alignment. It comes after she's peeled back every story, every wound, every hope she once tied to being heard. And what's left is something unshakable. A woman who no longer explains herself, not because she's cold, but because she knows her truth doesn't need confirmation to be valid. She doesn't need to convince him anymore. She doesn't need to chase his awareness. Because she understands now, his silence isn't a mystery, it's a message. And her own silence, in return, becomes her answer. An answer that says, I trust the energy more than the words. I trust myself more than the story. And I trust love enough to let it breathe, even in my stillness. This is how power is reclaimed, not by becoming louder, but by no longer echoing where there is no resonance. And in this space of deep self-respect, she doesn't close her heart. She centers it. She doesn't put up walls. She anchors boundaries. She doesn't carry bitterness. She releases expectation. And what returns to her in this vibration is not noise, but truth. Real love begins to feel her again, not as a force trying to pull, but as a field that magnetizes. Because energy doesn't lie. And a woman standing in the stillness of her self-worth is louder than 1,000 unsent messages. He feels it, even if he doesn't know how to name it, even if he doesn't know what to do with it, even if he's not yet ready to rise, to meet it. He feels the shift. He feels the silence that now holds more gravity than all the words she once gave away. This is how the divine feminine becomes the mirror, not the messenger. The vibration, not the voice. The invitation, not the instruction. And in this return to herself, she learns to trust the unfolding, not because it's easy, but because she's ready. Ready to stop filling in the blanks. Ready to stop bleeding energy where it's not received. Ready to let her silence speak the language of boundaries, clarity, and truth. Because her voice is still sacred. She's just saving it for where it can be heard, not just heard back. And until then, she holds herself in quiet, not as an escape, but as a homecoming. The kind of home where the masculine will one day return, not because she called, but because he recognized her stillness as the echo of his own soul finally awakening. If you look for her in the old places, in the silence that once carried sadness, in the spaces where she used to wait with hope clinging to her chest, in the corners of energy where she poured all of her love just to feel something echo back, you won't find her there anymore. Because she's not gone. She's simply no longer where you left her. She didn't vanish. She transformed. And what's emerging now isn't a version of her you'll easily recognize. Because the woman who once twisted herself into understanding, who tried to fit into his unreadiness, who stayed gentle in the face of emotional absence, she's no longer leading the way. What's rising is a wiser version, more rooted, more radiant, less interested in proving and more aligned with being. She's not angry, she's not bitter, she's simply done bleeding for a connection that must rise on its own legs now. Because love, real love, doesn't ask her to wait in the ache. It asks her to live, to expand, to hold the field of the sacred without crumbling when it isn't returned in the way her mind once imagined. That's why this silence is so powerful. Because it's not her exit, it's her becoming. Becoming the woman who trusts her body more than breadcrumbs. Becoming the soul who lets the divine timing hold what she no longer needs to carry. Becoming the mirror that reflects only truth, even if that truth is that he's not ready. But readiness is no longer her concern. Her concern now is embodiment of her light, of her path, of her mission, of her joy. Because what once felt like waiting now feels like wasting. And she can't do that anymore, not when her spirit is calling her forward with such force, such beauty, such unstoppable clarity. She can love him and still walk away from the version of the story where she wasn't fully seen. She can remember him and still stop shrinking to keep the door open. She can honor the connection and still surrender the outcome. Because her silence isn't a closing. It's a reopening inward. A return to the voice inside her that says, "You've always been the one you were waiting for." And in that remembrance, she doesn't need his response to feel complete. She doesn't need his arrival to validate her knowing. She doesn't need his awakening to believe in her light. If it's real, it will return. And if it doesn't, she now trusts that her path will bring her exactly what her soul called in long before he appeared. So if you feel like you're disappearing, if your world feels quieter, if your heart no longer wants to scream, if your energy is turning inward in a way that feels like death and rebirth at once, you are not gone. You are becoming. Becoming the one who doesn't beg for love. Becoming the one who doesn't dilute her truth. Becoming the one who walks through silence with her head high and her energy clean. And the masculine, he will feel it, not as loss, but as gravity. As an invitation to finally meet her, not in the place of fantasy, but in the field of frequency. Because she no longer exists in the version of love where pain equals proof. She's entered the vibration where peace becomes the path. And only those who can match that frequency will find her there. So no, she's not gone. She's simply no longer making herself small enough to be found in his shadows. She's rising, becoming, remembering. And in her becoming, she is not asking to be followed. She is simply leading herself home.